So hello guys, I'm going to make a small review of a 4K TV that I recently bought. So this is the Hisense A6K series, and this one was interesting because at only 330 euros it supports VRR, ALLM, and it's also a 4K display with HDR support. However, HDR support on this display is not good. I'm going to talk about it later. But for gaming, I still think it's actually very good. And because this is an IPS display, it will not suffer from issues like image retention or stuff like that. I actually think for SDR content, it is actually a pretty good display. Now, for stuff like HDR and 4K Blu-ray, you may want a better display, something like a TCL display. This one also does not support HDMI 2.1 fully. It only supports some HDMI 2.1 features, but the extra bandwidth that come with HDMI 2.1 is not supported. So basically at 4K, you only get YUV 422, and for full RGB, you only get 1080p basically. So this is a bit of an issue if you want to use this as your main PC monitor, because if you want to use 4K, you cannot use RGB, and it is not YUV 444. And that's an issue because you will notice the dithering on colors. Of course, it depends on your desktop environment. If you use something like KDE on Linux, for example, you may not notice this. But if you use something like JMW, well, I think that's the window manager that I use. If you use like a really simple window manager, like I do, you will notice the dithering on the colors. Now, that's not noticeable when you are actually gaming or when you are watching videos, but that's something to keep in mind if you want to use this for casual PC stuff. Anyway, I'm going to show you how it performs on the PS5 and then show you some other consoles as well. Okay, so I'm just going to show you my PS5 settings and what it actually supports on this display. So I was happy to see that it supports ALLM, which is auto low latency mode. So this is going to have pretty good input lag on this display, and I can confirm it. There is also VRR support, which is even better. So basically when the game drops below 60, the refresh rate will get adjusted. Now, this isn't useful for some games, especially Final Fantasy 16, which tends to drop often below 48 FPS. So unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet for everything, but it is neat to have, especially on a budget TV like this one. So YUV422, so not RGB, and yeah, we do have VRR, HDR, but you should not buy this display for HDR support because it is pretty bad and there's no local dimming also. And I also need to say, well, a couple of notes actually. So you're supposed to set up this display either wall mounted, or you're supposed to watch it from the bottom, so below. Otherwise, you will notice the backlight bleeding on the sides, whereas if you mount it on the wall or you watch it from below, you will not notice this. I'm pointing that out because if you intend to use this screen as a PC monitor, this will be something that you will notice. Now, to be fair, it's not a huge deal. If you're gaming, unless it's a full black screen, you will not see this issue. Like for example here, I do not notice the backlight bleeding, but if I'm going back to my PC, then I will notice the backlight bleeding on the sides. That's something to keep in mind, but as long as you do the right stuff, so you wall mount it, or you set up your TV properly, then the picture quality I think is pretty good for SDR content. I mean, the colors are pretty decent, and I mostly appreciate the extra sharpness that I get over 1080p. And I can confirm that this is not a fake 4K screen, unlike some of the other cheaper 4K displays, which are only really 1080p screens and with some weird trickery, so they're pretty bad 4K. Now, as for HDR, I have a game right here which does support it, but I'm going to be honest with you guys, I could not notice any difference between SDR and HDR, and I have tweaked my settings properly, so it's not like I did something wrong. Yeah, so it should be barely visible. Yes, there we go. So yes, 23. Wow, that's about right. But yeah, I mean, if I look at the sun or whatever, I don't see extra brightness or whatever. I don't see any difference. So let's look at the sun right here. And yeah, again, that's the same. Oops, I dropped my remote right here. That's fine. So yeah, if you intend to buy this for HDR, then avoid it because it looks the same as SDR. So yeah, but besides that, I think it for HDR it's actually very good, and it supports VRR and ALLM, as I said earlier. 4K Blu-rays, they look sharp, but again, no HDR, so do keep that in mind. So basically, it's gonna be like Blu-rays, but without the HDR. So a bit funny, but yeah. And let's try the Switch just to show you how it looks. And I honestly love how the Switch looks on this display. Alright, so here's the Switch. And I do like the look of it. Now, I actually think that I enable the blue light filter, which obviously you can disable on a per source basis, so you don't have to do it for everything. In fact, you should turn that off. Especially for gaming. Yeah, it was turned on. Yes, there we go. That looks much better already. Yeah, but you can just turn game mode on, and this looks good. Now for the color temperature, I think standard here actually looks the best, but sometimes you may prefer cool instead. There's an overscan setting which can be useful if you're doing stuff like OSSE 5X, but I think it already does the overscan, so that depends on what you do actually. There's a black level setting. I think it looks better on auto. And you can adjust the white balance, but unfortunately that's a bit beyond my expertise. Sadly, I'm not really an expert when it comes to tweaking TV settings. But if you set it to game mode on, I honestly think that you will be happy with how it looks. I don't think this needs a ton of changes or tweaking. And I think I, so yes, there we go. Now on Switch games like this one, you will notice the aliasing. Some games do target 1080p with 2x MSAA, but those are pretty rare. And if you wonder if the sharpness settings does anything to help with Switch graphics, I'm going to tell you that no, it doesn't. I already tried it, but all it does is just makes it more pixelated. So it makes it look awful actually. And curiously, there's a setting called dot by dots in aspect ratio. You do need to turn off game mode for that. And yeah, now you may think that this mode could be useful, but in reality it's not actually useful in most cases. So for instance, if you have say the upcoming Pixel FX, which can do 4K, I'm going to say some bullshit like that, and it only does a 4:3, then this could be useful. But I mean, the thing is, it really it only shows you, it's really for messing around. You shouldn't use this on a day-by-day basis. So for example, you want to see how sharp the pixels are, or how big or small 1080p is, because this is 1080p on the 4K display. So it's good for debugging, I guess, but it's not actually useful. There is a movie zoom feature. I'm not really sure what that is, and as you can tell, it zooms way too much. So there's a 4:3, very useful, if especially if you're using like an OSSC. I do believe it is setting it automatically, because in the case of Gamecube, it did set it to 4:3 by default. But if you have a GameCube game that needs a widescreen or uses like anamorphic widescreen, then you can set it manually to 16:9. So, I mean, yeah, this pretty much covers everything. Curiously, there's also a settings for 21:9. So some movies actually target this format, but this is not a 20:9, sorry, screen. So you do not want to use this in most cases. So I'm just going to turn game mode on. And yeah, for Switch, I actually think that it looks pretty lovely actually. So I mean, a bit overkill to be honest. And especially since the Switch can only target like 1080p, with the exception of course of the Android port on Switch, which can do 4K at 60 Hz. But that's besides the point. I mean, this is the exception rather than the rule. On the official firmware, you can only do 1080p 68 FPS. So yeah. Now I'm going to show you how Gamecube performs on this display. So this is Gamecube, and as you may notice, it looks decent. I do believe I have bulb, yes, I do have bulb deinterlacing turned on this display. And I can actually disable that, but the issue is that this will introduce more input lag, probably far worse than I want it to be, but that's fine anyway, because on the GameCube you can force most games to 480p. So let's try Smash Melee for example. So this game supports progressive scan natively. And I also forgot to mention one thing. You have to make sure to close down your windows and use this display in a dark room, because otherwise you will see yourself on the TV screen, and yeah, you don't want that. Unfortunately, this display really isn't meant for a lit environment. So I'm going to turn up the volume. I oops. Yeah. I made a mistake. Yeah, the reason why the input lag is a bit bad is because I'm actually using the Wavebird controller, and totally do not recommend using the Wavebird for Smash Melee because it's pretty noticeable, even though it is only 1 or 2 frames of lag. And I don't think this display is perfect either. Yeah. And unfortunately, I'm not able to accurately measure the input lag. There's something called the 240p test suite, but I don't have it on my SD card right now, on my Gamecube at least. So yeah, I'll have to take my word for it. I think it's good enough. And I don't have a wired controller either, so yeah, that's... Alright, so Gamecube works pretty well. I also tried the sharpness settings on this, and it only made the pixels more pixelated, so pretty much useless in this case. I mean, given that this is 480p, it looks pretty good actually. I do wish there was some kind of anti-aliasing over it, but yeah. I also tried the OSSC with the PlayStation 2 on it, and it performs pretty well. I was able to use 1080i also on this display with the OSSC, which some displays do not like. And there are also some apps that are provided on this small TV. Now, I said that the TV that I have does not have Android TV. Instead, it has something called Vita. And yeah, I'm going to use my Wi-Fi. So I'm just putting my hand over the camera. I don't want to bother. Yes, there we go. So I'm going to go over on YouTube. And interestingly enough, there is a microphone inside of this TV. Linus Tech Tips. And this is really like the small TV. This isn't like my PS5 or whatever. And I do think for casual YouTube stuff, it looks pretty good. Well, except the ads, they look pretty bad. But that's besides the point. And of course, you cannot skip the ads. Except this one.
This is a gaming PC made by Sega, of all people, called the ALLS.
The UI is pretty slow, especially if you're targeting 4K.
It's for sale today for use in arcade games. It's got a 6th Gen Core i5 processor, a GTX 1070, 16 gigs of RAM.
I actually, yes, it does look pretty good, and it is usable if you don't have a PS5. But if you already have a PS5 or Xbox Series S or even Series X, you're much better off using that instead of your TV. You do have a wide selection of streaming apps on this TV, but don't expect to play games on it. And even if you could, on like the US version of this TV, the MediaTek that's inside of this TV isn't a very good chip. So I would forget about doing stuff like that on this TV, to be honest. So what do I think of it? I think it's actually a pretty good display for PS5 and some other gaming consoles, especially when it comes to SDR. Now, unfortunately, HDR on this display is really, really bad. So I would not choose this TV for 4K Blu-rays or even Netflix, because HDR, I could not tell the difference between SDR and HDR. It was the same to me. So unfortunately, it doesn't get very bright. You may want instead the TCL series. So for an extra $100, you can get much better HDR. And if you want to go above that, you can spend around $600 on a much better TV. And even for $600, you may even luck out on a 8K TV, albeit used naturally. And this is also not OLED, so the blacks are not really black. But despite that, I still think that it is a pretty good display, all things considered. To me, this is the best budget TV that you can get for your gaming consoles right now. Now, for movies, I would still not use this. You probably have better options, as I said earlier, but probably not for cheaper, to be honest. Hisense, they do have another series of TVs that do not support VRR, but may look better for HDR, but I've been told it's pretty much the same, or actually worse for that matter. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and bye for now.